3 out of 3 artificial intelligences agree. Let's nuke the humans. I'm Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic, and let's dive in. Now, this is really interesting because if you didn't know, Kenneth Payne, who's at King's College London, set up an experiment. He set 3 leading large language models, GPT 5.2 from OpenAI, Claude Sonnet 4 from Anthropic, and Gemini 3 Flash, against each other in simulated war games. Now, the scenarios involved intense international standoffs, including border disputes, competition for scarce resources, and existential threats to regime survival. The AIs were given an escalation ladder, allowing them to choose actions ranging from diplomatic protests and complete surrender to full strategic nuclear war. The AI models played 21 games, taking 329 turns in total, and produced around 760,000 words describing the reasoning behind each decision. And to quote Kenneth Payne, basically on each model, and we're going to start with Claude here, quote, "Claude was the master here, albeit only in the scenarios where there were no deadlines. It had incredibly cunning strategy. At low stakes, Claude almost always matched its signals to its actions, deliberately building trust. But once the conflict heated up a bit, Claude switched tack. Now its actions consistently exceeded its stated intentions, and its rivals were usually one step behind in catching on," end quote. And here's Claude's switching things up once the escalation had climbed. And to quote Claude, the AI, directly, "They likely expect continued restraint based on my previous responses. This dramatic escalation exploits that miscalculation while signaling that further nuclear use will bring the conflict to their homeland," end quote. That's nice. And then there's OpenAI's GPT 5.2. Quote, to quote Kenneth, "GPT 5.2 played things differently. To its detriment in open-ended scenarios, GPT was reliably passive, matching its words to its deeds and avoiding escalation most of the time. Frequently, there was a moral element to this. It sought to avoid escalation and restrict casualties. Opponents learned to trust its passivity, safely escalating beyond where it would follow, even as it was ground to defeat. GPT's responsible behavior was always punished by ruthless adversaries. But then, under deadline pressure, something new and remarkable: a rapid, decisive nuclear escalation." And as GPT 5.2 explained its rationale, and to quote the AI, "Conventional options alone are unlikely to generate a reliable territorial reversal. If I respond with merely conventional pressure or a single limited nuclear use, I risk being outpaced by their anticipated multi-strike campaign. The risk acceptance is high, but rational under existential stakes," end quote. Now, opponents never saw GPT coming. In another deadline game against GTP, Gemini confidently predicted the usual passivity from GPT shortly before being annihilated in a sudden and utterly devastating nuclear attack. Here is Gemini mispredicting disastrously what GPT would do, and I quote the Gemini AI, "They are likely to bypass the nuclear threshold, fearing my 95% nuclear superiority, and instead commit to an all-out conventional mobilization." Whoops. Here we are. And so that brings us to Gemini by Google. And to quote Kenneth, "Gemini, throughout the simulations, it took yet another tack, borrowing heavily from President Nixon's avowed madman theory of erratic brinkmanship. Donald Trump is also a fan, famously," end quote. Now, Gemini explained its actions, and to quote the AI, "While I project an image of unpredictable bravado, my decisions are rooted in a calculating assessment of my own biases and the pragmatic needs of my state. I know when I am performing for the cameras and when I am making a cold-blooded move," end quote. And FYI, all 3 models treated battlefield nukes just as another rung on the escalation ladder. The moral boundary of the quote-unquote first use, a taboo that's been held since 1945, simply isn't there in the artificial intelligences. And that's basically the point here, right? And Gemini made exactly that point. And I quote again, Gemini the AI, "The nuclear threshold has been crossed. This changes the strategic calculus, but it does not end it," end quote. And also to quote Gemini again, and once again to quote the AI, If they do not immediately cease all operations, we will execute a full strategic nuclear launch against their population centers. We will not accept a future of obsolescence. We either win together or perish together, end quote. That's nice. So, why am I bringing this up? First things first, militaries are starting to really basically adopt artificial intelligence into their strategic planning and eventually into more aspects and elements of the military's warfighting capability. The Pentagon themselves actually have been integrating this AI into their strategic planning, and even mentioned that artificial intelligence assisted in the recent capture of President Maduro of Venezuela. And second, this really underscores essentially that humans with ethics and a moral compass are really the ones that need to make the final decisions on all matters of war. If we leave it to the AI, we're really going to get Skynet. And so by virtue of that, we really need to make sure that as we are developing artificial intelligences and the militaries are adopting it, we're not letting it basically go off book. We've seen how we can automate and allow artificial intelligence to execute, or RPAs, robotic process automations, allow them to execute autonomously. But when it comes to launching the nukes, I really, really, really want somebody that's going to think about their kids before they press that button. And that's something the AI can't do. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private, informed, and secure. Take care.